The story or stories you are about to hear are to entertain. The writers of these stories may claim they are true, yet they may not be. That is up to you to decide. After all, this world is a strange one. Work is rough. Imagine working 48 hours a week. You hurt and damage your body more and more every day. Then pay a quarter of what you make to the government, if not more. And by the time you get home each day, you're far too tired from work to enjoy what you used to love. Scary, huh? Well, work can get even scarier. From crazy customers and coworkers to strange creatures or even hauntings. Even a place as rough as work can get much, much worse. These are 5 disturbing work stories. If you have a scary story, share it with us at darkstories.org. I'm looking for monsters seen in Canada. Now, let's begin. Grandfather's Goodbye from Nurse Cookies. I used to work at an assisted living facility for people with dementia. It was a summer job in the first year of my nursing studies. And let me tell you, they do not pay you enough for that crap. I was very quickly put alone in charge of half a floor, roughly 8 old women, all in various stages of different kinds of dementia. Mostly sweet, sometimes temperamental. Meeting them all was pretty much the only positive thing about that job. Otherwise, it was too much work with too little manpower. I think most places like this have their fair share of creepy stories. After all, usually people come there with the full intention of leaving either by ambulance or in a casket. That generates things like this. The great mysticism of death is soon taken away when you work in what is essentially palliative care, but some of it always remains. This place's specialty were the elevators. I was never sure if it was just a joke played to scare the newbies, but these elevators did an inordinate amount of suddenly starting up and stopping at a floor without anyone on them. I suppose one of the other nurses from the other floor could have sent them up, but I really can't see anyone having any free time in that place. From another worker, I heard a story that she had once heard someone get out of the elevator, tell her she was going home, and then get back in the elevator going down. Night shifts were terrible after stories like that, and besides, the place had enough creepy factor for a horror movie or two. There was one lift that creaked its way down into the basement full of little rooms, which we, mostly women under 5'7", had to check every evening because we had no on-site security. We usually did it in pairs. At night, there would be 3 nurses in the house, almost one for every floor. One of us had 1.5 floors to deal with. Being alone on the floor, which held up to 16 residents, with decently sized rooms, was not fun. As long as there were things to do, it was all right, but when everyone was sleeping, and tomorrow's meds had been counted, and the breakfast sandwiches had been prepared, it quickly gets uncomfortable. Usually it was just boring, but if your mindset was right, it could be downright terrifying. People with dementia make the weirdest noises in their sleep, too. One night, I was in that mindset. I had just checked the basement alone, because a resident on the floor of the nurse who was supposed to be with me was close to death, and she didn't want to leave him alone. I'd counted the meds, prepared most of the sandwiches, done my rounds. It was close to 1, and I was in the kitchen finishing the sandwiches. I'd been busy with the resident, so I was a little behind schedule. The resident had wanted to talk late into the night, and I'd indulged her. Her room was odd. It was very homely. She'd been living there for a while. She never turned the lights off because she hated the dark, for one. Then there was the truly unsettling amount of clocks ticking away unevenly all around her, and in the middle of the room on the coffee table, positioned so she could see it from the bed, was a picture of a gravestone. It had her parents' and siblings' names on it, and an empty space for her name. It unnerved me and the other nurses, but it seemed to calm the old woman down. At every hour, one huge grandfather clock in her room would strike. Anyway, I had torn myself away from there to make my rounds. We did them every 2 hours, and returned to the sandwiches. I was standing in the kitchen minding my own business when I heard the lift doors open. I turned, thinking the other 2 nurses had come down to get coffee with me, and was met with only an empty lift. I confess my heart skipped a beat right then and there. I hated those elevators with a passion, and had never yet had one do that to me when I was alone. It was one thing to have it stop and then to be able to joke about it with the residents, and quite another thing to just be treated to the quiet slide of the opening doors and the emptiness inside. Not to mention, I knew that the gentleman downstairs was dying. To put myself at ease, I called the other nurse and asked her how he was doing. Fine was the answer. Nothing was different. I berated myself for being dumb, thanked her, and went back to slapping ham and cheese on those sandwiches. I was just beginning to relax when I heard the grandfather clock start striking 1. I didn't pay much mind to it until it just would not stop at all. When it had been a full 5 minutes, I once again abandoned the sandwiches and headed over to the room where I knew the sound was coming from. I prepared myself to start figuring out how to fix it. But once I was there and saw the clock, I realized it stopped striking. The old woman was on her bed, fast asleep. By then, I was well and truly creeped out. I hightailed it out of there. The worst thing was that the sound of the clock began fading back in as soon as the clock was out of view. I hid in the well-lit office until the 3rd nurse came down to have some coffee and a salad. By then, mercifully, the sound had stopped, but the silence wasn't much better. Sometime into our coffee break, the 2nd nurse came in and delivered the news that I'd been dreading. The resident had died a little past 1, around the same time that clock had struck. This is the first time anything like this has ever happened to me, and I hope it will be the last. But I doubt it. There's something about death, or the spirit of life, that we don't fully understand, and if you work around dying people, these things may happen to you. Paranormal at my work. From Anonymous. I'm 19 and I've worked for the lumber plant in the next town over in East Texas for about a year now. I work the 3rd shift, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. on weekends and 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. on weekdays. I always get an unnerved feeling at night. It started after my training was finished. I have to do rounds inside the plant every so often during the weekend, and once at 3 a.m. on weekdays. I was out one Friday night, doing my round as I always had, when I felt as if I wasn't alone, felt like someone was watching me, and whoever they were, I couldn't see them. And that's when it started. I heard a loud slam on the bottom of the vehicle I used for my rounds. It was so sudden and so loud that I literally screamed at first. I tried to speed out of there as fast as I could. Whatever it was started hitting the top of the car after that. I either lost it or it got bored with me, but it stopped messing with me for the night after I sped away. When I got to the upstairs portion, I started feeling like I was being followed again. I kept hearing someone walking behind me with wooden boards creaking and groaning. I turned to see what it was, but of course I saw nothing. Thinking it was my imagination, I turned around and ventured further into the mill. That's when I got flashes of images of a man who had been burned beyond recognition, a few patches of skin intact, a small patch of black hair, sunken eye sockets without eyelids. I couldn't see a nose, and it had a gap where its lips used to be, with holes in his cheeks. When I saw him, my heart started thudding in my chest. There are cameras in the upstairs part, so I couldn't exactly run in terror without being questioned, so I acted calm and started walking again. I'd heard that spirits can't physically harm you, so I tried to push it out of my mind and kept saying to myself that it was just my imagination. Well, how wrong I was. I began hearing creaking and groaning again, followed by footsteps behind me. I speed-walked to the stairs leading to the ground, and that's when I heard a deafening crash. I spun around but didn't see anything, so I ran down the 2 flights of metal stairs till my feet touched the concrete beneath the mill. I didn't stop running until I was in the cart and on my way to the next key. The next key was near an old building they don't use anymore. I'd heard that there was something that stands at the back of the long porch in the shadows that liked to stare at you. So I was told how to park where the porch is illuminated by the LED light on the front of the cart. I always feel watched when I'm over there, so I keep my eyes on the part where it's said to be. But I've never seen it. Not until that night. This happened on a Saturday, so I didn't really have a set time to do my round. I left out at 2 a.m. I got to the old abandoned office building, and I kept my eyes on the back part of the porch. That was a horrible mistake. I eyed it over to make sure it was undisturbed, and turned to go back to the cart. For some reason, I looked down, but I'm glad I did because nothing could prepare me for what I saw on the other side of the railing. It resembled an old man in what I imagined a goblin would look like. It was a sickly gray color and hunched down like it was hiding. Its neck was bent to where its face was looking straight up at me. It had this toothy smile on its face. I looked down to where my legs were, and I saw its scraggly hands attempt to wrap its arms around my legs. I proceeded to run as fast as I could to the cart, getting the heck out of Dodge. That was the last time I saw the Burning Man and that goblin, but their images are burned into my head, probably for the rest of my life. I currently work there still, where I always feel watched, and to those of you who say that the paranormal isn't real, or that these 2 of many other encounters are simply fictional, I dare you to spend a week in my shoes. At the end of the week, I'm sure you'd be a believer as well. They can stop time. From username REDACTED. I'm 24 years old, and I work in a popular English restaurant. It was recently hit by a bizarre event. That day started pretty normal. I clocked in for my shift, changed into my uniform, and started doing some work at the computer. Work that I was supposed to do over the weekend, but I never got to it. I worked for 2 hours straight, but then something happened. The mouse and monitor froze. I tried unplugging and plugging them back in, but that didn't work. I tried turning the whole thing on and off, both on the tower and at the wall, but it remained on. Eventually, I figured I'd have to go tell my boss the computer crashed, though it kind of freaked me out that the monitor and mouse remained on, even though I'd unplugged everything. I left the office and headed for the restaurant floor. That was where I saw her last. I opened the door to the restaurant and stopped. According to the clock in our office, it was 12:01, meaning that the lunch rush should be in full swing, as the majority of customers arrive between 11:55 and 12 o'clock. As expected, the restaurant was filled with customers, but no one was moving. When I say that no one was moving, I don't mean to say that everyone just was staying in one spot. I mean no one was moving at all. They were all playing musical statues, and someone had stopped the music. Except, why would they be doing this? It made no sense. As I slowly walked through the seemingly motionless restaurant, I bumped into someone. Turning around, I saw that it was my boss, frozen in the middle of looking at her watch, which, like the clock on the wall, also read 12:01. To fully confirm my suspicions, I grabbed the arm of a woman, frozen with a spoonful of soup halfway to her lips, and saw that her watch also said 12:01. Scanning the entire restaurant, it did not take a genius to figure out that every watch or clock or timepiece displayed the exact same moment in time. To say that I was at a loss was an understatement. I mean, the first thought going through my head was that this paralysis was the result of food poisoning or gas inhalation, but that theory went out the window once I began seeing things that I was sure were beyond the fire brigade and ambulance services jurisdiction. On the table next to the soup woman sat a couple. The man was frozen in the middle of cutting a steak, and the woman, maybe his wife, fiancé, girlfriend, whatever, she was frozen in the middle of pouring water into her glass. The weird thing about this was that the water had stopped moving as well, frozen in between the jug and the glass. Near the kitchen, one of my colleagues, Maisie, had frozen in the middle of lighting some candles for a couple out on a date. The flames on the candles and the match held in Maisie's hand stood rigid, like soldiers on parade, and a table occupied by a family, the boy had frozen with his head back and his mouth open. Looking up, I saw a single pea suspended in midair, like it was attached to a piece of string. I was just coming out of the kitchen, having checked on the staff in the kitchen, when I heard the front doorbell sound. Curious as to who was seemingly unaffected by this strange phenomenon, I peeked around the corner and had to stifle a gasp. Standing in the entryway were two things. Upon first glance, they could be mistaken for humans, but looking closer, they weren't. For starters, they were 2 feet taller than everyone else in the restaurant. Their skin was so tight, it looked like their ribs would burst out of their bodies. It was their eyes that really made me feel uncomfortable. They were thin, narrow slits, black as ink, as if there was nothing within them. They looked around at the frozen staff and customers, then made a sort of low, rasping sound. Call me crazy, but I think they found the sight funny. As I watched, they split and began to flank the frozen people, getting close to them, sniffing their hair, skin, and clothes, prodding them with their long, bony fingers. What they did next really took me by surprise. To my horror, I watched as one of them stopped next to the soup woman and sniffed her. It then sniffed her soup and made that strange rasping sound again, before picking up the soup bowl and placing it upside down on the woman's head. I honestly didn't know what to do, besides standing still. I figured these creatures were likely behind everyone being frozen too, and I had no idea what they'd do to me if they found out that I was still moving. So I simply watched. I watched as they moved the woman with the water, placing her arm in such a way that she was pouring the water on her head. Then they blew at the candles and match Maisie was holding, setting them up to blow out as soon as time restarted. I watched one of them part a couple who had been frozen as they were about to kiss. It took all my strength not to cringe as it began to place its mouth over the man's mouth, imitating some sort of disgusting kiss. The creature went up to a woman then, who'd frozen mid-sneeze, but the creature didn't mind. What it did next makes me shudder. It placed its mouth over her nose and began to devour whatever was inside. Mucus, of course. The woman was lucky that she had no idea what was happening to her. The creature's next target was my boss, One of them examined the collection of pens and pencils she kept in her top pocket, while the other examined her trousers. I watched as the first creature plucked a black Sharpie from out of her pocket, began to rasp again. As I continued to watch, not even daring to blink in case they saw me, the creature popped the lid off the Sharpie, sniffing it, and then finding out what the object did by running it over my boss's face, leaving a big black trail. Seemingly satisfied, it then placed the Sharpie in my boss's hand, stepping back and taking in the scenery. It had apparently loosened her trousers, setting her up for some embarrassment. Whilst I'd been watching them, I failed to realize that they'd gone through most of the restaurant, which meant it was my turn. The creatures turned toward me, pacing around me. I was using every ounce of strength I had not to move, not to give myself away. Seeing as they thought I was frozen like everyone else, I realized I was going to have to let them do what they liked with me. I held my breath and kept as motionless as possible. It was extremely difficult to just not move my pupils. They placed food on me, turning my clean garb into a mess of a getup. Once everyone in the restaurant had been vandalized in some way, the creatures finally left, and I waited a few seconds before I dared to move and started sorting myself out. No sooner had I wiped as much of the cream off my head as possible, everyone in the restaurant suddenly started up again. I think it's fair to say the restaurant immediately broke out into chaos. The lady with the water screamed as water cascaded onto her head. The soup woman was about to put the spoon in her mouth when her pea soup landed all over her. Maisie sighed as the candles in the match went out, and the kissing couple gagged as they began to feel the effects of the beast's saliva, and the woman who'd been sneezing continued before pulling at her nose, sniffing hard. My boss, pulling up her trousers, did not see her own predicament, with the Sharpie on her face, but due to the chaos around her, no one else seemed to care either. It's been a couple of days since this, and so far things have been normal. My boss managed to smooth things out with the customers, and I haven't seen anything weird for a while. Time definitely hasn't stopped again. Well, as far as I know. The following story was labeled a creepypasta. They found something buried underneath. From AmmeJeanRomeo. I've been working at my local university for a little under a year now. A few months back, we moved out of our old office building onto the 5th floor of another. The purpose of the move was to allow builders to begin work on demolishing our old building, along with 3 other buildings on the campus. This was a part of the university's redevelopment plan, ahead of this Cultural City Award they are nominated for and could possibly win in 2021. I didn't know there was such a thing either, until I started working there. Anyway, by the time we moved, they had already started work on one of the older buildings. It used to house what was called the School of Life Sciences, but had been left vacant even before I started working there. Looking out the window of our new office, I have a clear view of the demolition site. One weekend, they closed off the road to start bringing down the building. So when I came back into work the following Monday, I was surprised to see that they had just demolished the middle section of the building. It looked pretty funny, actually, as though someone had split the building down the middle and the 2 halves had started to drift away from each other. It wasn't long after that I began to hear rumors. One lunchtime, I'd been set in our communal kitchen canteen area, just eating my lunch and messing around on my phone as I do every lunchtime. I caught snippets of a conversation some of my work colleagues were having a couple of tables away. I craned my ear closer trying to listen. Apparently, builders had uncovered bones buried a couple of feet down beneath the ground of the demolition site. That, in and of itself, was a creepy discovery. But for whatever reason, the university had decided to keep the news under wraps, or so at least the stern-looking, slightly older of the two claimed. The other woman, a rather meek-looking person with a round face that belied her age, was listening to the other's story with rapt attention. The older of the two continued and explained that she started to ask around campus to find out more. Supposedly, a couple of the university's science professors have been called onto the scene and had been asked to look at the remains. They believed the bones were of 5 people, possibly 2 women and 3 children. It was at this point in her story that both of the women suddenly turned to look at me. I had drifted closer still to their table without realizing it. They both frowned at me, gathered up their things, and bustled out of the room. I watched them retreat with a frown of my own, but soon I dismissed it. Workplaces are known for being rumor mills, after all, so I didn't really put much stock in the gossip of 2 middle-aged women. As the weeks passed, the rumors continued. Even my own manager was fascinated by the discovery and started coming up with her own theories. Something she mentioned, though, did grab my attention, and I asked her to further explain. Around 50 years ago, and importantly in the middle of the life sciences building being constructed, there were stories in the local news of a cult that had come to the city. The papers warned not to associate or get involved with them, as they were believed to be Satanists. It was also while the cult resided in the city that there were a string of disappearances. Young men and women going out to meet their friends one evening and never returning. Young children being snatched on their way home from school. Eventually, the building construction finished, and with it all traces of the cult vanished, and no one else disappeared. Though sadly, they never managed to find all those missing people. I was fascinated by this tale, and when I got home that night, I did my own research about the city. In the year that the cult lived in the city, 30 people went missing, all traces of them apparently gone. Many people claim to have seen members of the cult camping out in the local wooded areas, where they could be found dressed in dark robes and dancing around a burning fire. Some said it was all made up, that there was no cult at all, but none could explain the disappearances. As the years had passed, it seemed the city had all but forgotten about this time, until now. The demolition of the remainder of the building continues, and I often find myself watching the workmen from my office window. Every now and then I get this strange feeling in the pit of my stomach, as though I'm not the only person doing the watching. As I look out the window and train my eyes on the building, I could swear someone is looking back at me. I wish I could say this is where the story ends, but it's not. In the last 3 weeks, 2 students have gone missing. Supposedly, they were 2 friends who thought it would be funny to sneak into the demolition site at night, to see if they could find any bones or spirits. They took a larger group of friends with them, who waited outside of the restriction zone as the 2 boys climbed over the barrier. As the other waited, around 10 minutes passed, and they all grew worried. Just as another boy was about to go over the barrier to check if his friends were okay, they all heard an inhuman scream and the sound of rubble falling. The rest of the group ran away scared and only thought to call the police once they were a good distance away. Both boys had been crushed by a crumbling support beam they had walked under. The tragedy was deemed an accident, the result of 2 reckless young men. The university was closed for a few days after that, out of respect for the 2 boys who had lost their lives. When it reopened, you could see the unease on everyone's faces. We're all trying to just continue on with our lives, but I can't help but wonder, was the beam falling really an accident, or have we somehow unearthed some vengeful spirits? I mean, no one really knows who those bones belong to. And one other thought keeps lurking at the back of my mind, one I try not to think about too much. Maybe, just maybe, that cult from 50 years ago has come back for round 2. Well, it's time for me to clock out. Here's to hoping the drive home from work isn't full of ghosts and ghouls and 2-meter-tall kangaroos more ripped than prime Dwayne Johnson. I mean, the last thing I need after a long day of work is to have my shiz kicked in by one big bouncy boy. If you think I'm joking, just take a look at Australia. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode of Darkness Prevails, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have your own story, I am looking for stories about Canadian monster sightings. Share them with us at darkstories.org. If you want to support the show, check out my merch store and Patreon in the description. Well, that may be all for these stories, but more are on the way, so stay tuned for the next episode. Until then, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate and support the show. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.